Remove the machine compartment cover from the rear of the unit, exposing the compressor, condenser, and refrigerant tubing. Check compressor, condenser, and along each tube using a combustible leak detector. If a release of refrigerant is detected, evacuate the area, notify the homeowner, and set up a ventilation fan to remove refrigerant until the leak detector reads a safe level. The ventilation fan must be utilized throughout the repair to ensure your safety. The fan should be placed at least 10 feet from the unit being serviced to prevent an ignition hazard. Before opening the sealed system, determine if the compressor is running. If it is working, run the compressor for about 10 minutes to allow time for the oil and refrigerant to warm and separate. This will help get the maximum amount of refrigerant out of the system. In our example, we used a temporary piercing valve on the process tube and piercing pliers on the dryer. Attach the high side hose to the pliers, but do not pierce system until it is verified that the high side valve is closed on the manifold gauge. Attach a temporary piercing valve per manufacturer's instructions, but do not pierce until it is connected to the low side hose on manifold gauge and the low side valve has been verified to be closed. Check all piercing devices using a combustible leak detector once system has been pierced to verify proper seal and no leaks before continuing with repair. Connect the discharge hose into a recovery vessel or run an exhaust hose outside the home through a window or door so that all the refrigerant can be evacuated. R600 does not need to be recovered and can be safely released into the environment, taking care to ensure no possible source of ignition is present. With a non-working compressor, open both sides of the system and allow to vent for a minimum of 12 minutes. You can shake and tap the compressor with a rubber mallet to assist in releasing trapped refrigerant from the oil. At this point, the gauge should read 0 and you can safely pinch the lines to the compressor before cutting the tubing and removing the compressor. You can also use an A3 certified vacuum pump with an external discharge or dry nitrogen to flush system residual R600 that may be present before cutting out components to replace. Always use tubing cutters to remove failed components, never a torch. Of steel lines may be replaced with copper tubing for situations where the tubing needs bending. Remember to keep the combustible gas leak detector running in the work area to ensure that no refrigerant has escaped. R600 is heavier than air, so it can pull behind components. The ventilation fan should always be running to draw air away from work area. Always use a flame retardant floor covering to protect the customer's flooring prior to brazing. Replacement of components can be done by brazing or solderless connector. Due to the aluminum heat exchanger used in some products, the use of solderless lock ring fittings is required. When component replacement is complete with an access valve installed on the process stub and filter dryer, install the valve cord depressor valve and connect the hoses to each valve. Hose connected to the low side of the manifold should also connect to the process tube access valve on the compressor. The hose connected to the high side of the manifold should be connected on the filter dryer access valve. It is recommended to use a manifold gauge with ports for charging and recovery. A T-fitting should be used with a valve on each line to help to isolate and test system if the charging port is not located on the manifold gauge set. The vacuum pump should connect to the auxiliary hose and auxiliary port of the manifold. Your charging hose connects to the bottle of R600 and the manifold gauge. If your manifold gauge has a charging valve, the charging hose should be connected there. Otherwise, connect the charging hose to the other valve located on the T-fitting on auxiliary hose. Ensure that the low side and high side valves are both closed on the manifold gauges and ensure the ball valve is closed on the auxiliary line to the vacuum pump. Open the high side and low side valve cord depressor valves. Power on the vacuum pump. Open the valve on auxiliary hose, the high side valve of the manifold, the low side valve of the manifold, and the valve for the charging hose. Run the vacuum pump for 1 minute. Closing the valve on the auxiliary hose, observe the low side gauge for any increase in pressure. If no movement is observed, run the vacuum pump for a minimum of 5 minutes before retesting for leaks. Again, close the valve on the auxiliary hose to check for any increase in pressure. If movement is observed, the system must be charged with nitrogen to locate the leak and repair. If no change is observed, continue with vacuum until the low side gauge reaches a minimum of a 28-inch vacuum. The pump should be run for a minimum of 18 minutes. Close the valve on auxiliary hose and charging valve, along with the high side valve and low side valve on the manifold. Power off the vacuum pump and observe low side gauge for any movement. Allow vacuum to hold for 15 minutes to check for any leaks. If the gauge needle does not move, it is ready to charge. Systems that require more than 40 grams of refrigerant must be charged with liquid. Secure charging hose to ensure it does not move. Turn on scale and zero out, making sure it is reading in grams. Carefully lift refrigerant cylinder from scale and open red valve on the bottle to allow refrigerant to flow into charging hose. Carefully set cylinder back on scale. It will register the weight difference based on the liquid in the hose. Open the check valve used on the charging hose to allow refrigerant to flow to manifold. Open the high side valve on manifold to allow refrigerant to flow into the system. Monitor the scale to ensure proper volume of refrigerant is used. In most cases, the system will not accept a full charge amount into the high side, and the compressor will need to be started to assist. Reconnect power to the unit. Close the high side valve on the manifold gauge set. Open and close the low side gauge, allowing the unit to slowly take in the remaining charge amount. Only allow the flow into the suction tube for a few seconds before closing the low side valve on the manifold. Allow 10 to 15 seconds between low side valve openings to prevent damaging or slugging the compressor. Once the full charge amount has been reached, close the red charging cylinder valve on R600 bottle. Leave open the valve on the charging hose to draw in any remaining refrigerant. Close the valve core depressor valve on high side, then open the high side manifold valve. Slowly open and close the low side manifold valve to allow any remaining liquid refrigerant to be drawn into the system from all hoses and manifold. Be careful not to damage or slug the compressor. Once the full charge has been pulled into the system from hoses and manifold set, close all valves. Disconnect the hoses and Schrader valve core depressor valves. Use the combustible leak detector to verify that there are no leaks from access ports on the dryer and process tube. To permanently seal off the system, crimp the tubing of the access ports and use lock ring lock prep solution to secure the cap. Apply red paint to the high side and low side access port caps to alert future service technicians that the unit contains flammable refrigerants and ensure that all warning labels remain in place. The R600a system is now charged and ready to use.